So now we're going to talk about queer theory, and your book does address queer theory some a little really in the chapter on feminist criticism. So there's some key terms here, and one of them we've already discussed and your book covers, and that's heteronormativity, the idea that the assumption that all things are heterosexual, even understanding queer relationships in straight terms, right? So that's what heteronormativity is about, making all things heterosexuality always the norm. Anything that's queer is always, by definition, what queer is, which is something that's odd or different, as opposed to what's straight, which is normal, right? So somebody who used to be somebody who didn't do drugs or who was involved in gang activity, they were straight. You might see an old movie and someone will say they went straight. It means they've given up a life of crime, right? So anyway, so heteronormativity is the idea that, yeah, that heterosexual sort of, if you will, straight sexuality is the norm, and yeah, and everything else is understood either through that lens or by comparison. We get also this notion of homophobia. I don't think I have to spend a lot of time defining this, although as we touch on some in gender, not a real phobia, because homophobia is largely is learned and the responses are really sort of consistent with what phobias might do. But anywho, right, it is the hatred or disgust of those who are in the LGBTQ community, as we're talking about homophobia. And so we get queer theory, right? And so queer theory is very similar to feminist theory, and it examines the many ways in which those who are LGBTQ are treated differently in society, regarded differently. And queer theory, like really feminist theory, has the goal or the hope or the ambition that all persons, regardless of sexual or gender orientation, will be treated with equal respect, and their experiences will be given sort of equal credibility and acceptance in society, which seems like a pretty small request. Right. So some general questions then of doing, if you will, queer criticism is how are queer sexualities or LGBTQ persons depicted, right? And so think about those questions before in feminist theory about men and women, right? That's very much similar thing here, right? So what ideologies about sexualities, or sexuality, I should say, or LGBTQ persons are perpetuated here? Are we saying that people who are uh, transgender or lesbian or gay or what have you, are they people who are not as trustworthy? Are they people who are oversexed? Are they people who never respond to things normally? Are they always the outlier, right? I mean, like the one who's like different from the group, right? So what's the depiction? What are we understanding then about sexuality from these depictions, right? And does the artifact challenge or reinforce homophobia and heterosexism? And heterosexism, by the way, is modestly different from homophobia. It's much as racism or sexism, it is the open discrimination against people who are not straight, who do not identify as heterosexual. That's what heterosexism is. So homophobia is more of a general social perception of people, treatment of people, or a lot about issues of stereotypes and so forth, right? Homophobia. But heterosexism, very similar. It has more to do with the actual discrimination, right? So yeah, much as sexism is about discrimination, racism about discrimination, based in, right? They're based in, misogyny for sexism and xenophobia, right, for racism. And I want to look at just a few examples very quickly here. These are some visual examples that are really about queer sexuality and the way that queer sexuality may not even always serve in its representations its own purposes. In fact, many times, because so much media is produced by those who are not queer identified, really queer sexuality is represented in a way that's meant for a straight audience. So here we have this ad, and we have two women. Seems to be something sexual going on here, but maybe it's just sort of a playfulness. And so it suggests even that whether these women identify as bisexual or lesbian or queer, that maybe they do, but maybe they identify as straight. And this homoerotic play, right? The eroticism between people of the same sex. It's just sort of play, it's just a goof, it's a playfulness, maybe not taken as seriously. Also, very much we get the impression that this is the way they're dressed and performing is being done for not for themselves, but for others, which is a recurring theme. When you look at this ad here from Gucci, right? So the two women, and both giving each other this very intense look. But think about how this is photographed, right? Here we are looking at the back of them, uh, and that's part of, especially the woman in the white dress, where we see part of her buttocks being revealed, right? This is, yeah, this is emphasizing that this depiction of them and their bodies is not for themselves. It is for us as the viewer. Anything about male gaze, who's the viewer expected to be? Often it's the perspective of the straight male desire. And this last image as well, very similar, right? The two women having some sort of moment, perhaps, except for one staring at the person who's then staring over at the camera, and all seems very much to be a performance that's not about what the two of them are experiencing, but something the two of them are doing and performing for an audience. And so in all these ways, as these depictions of possible lesbian sexuality or lesbian experience are really dismissed as being at all about the women themselves, or really even embracing and accepting a queer sexuality or a queer performance here, but probably much more about titillating a straight male view and sexuality.